Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we are going over the stuff which was in the files for the update Winged Lions dev server. This is the stuff which is extra, which I wasn't able to get into the actual dev server itself, and whether it wasn't finished yet or whether there was some other issue with it. Most of it is aircraft, but there is also some ships which are sat there, and there's a few other things which seem a little bit odd. So obviously you have the Israeli A4s which are coming, but both of these vehicles seem to be copy-pastes of the A4E late. I don't think there's too much difference between them, so what I'll do is I'll wait for them to come to the game to actually talk about them, kind of like the Votor 2N in a way, which is just a copy of the 2A right now, which is obviously not correct. So also remember, because this stuff is in the files, it doesn't mean that it's coming in the next update. There's a bunch of stuff that gets sat in the files for many years, basically, and never actually comes to the game, and eventually comes. The most prominent one I can think of is the Shackleton, weirdly enough, which eventually made it. One of the things also to note is I'm using the asset viewer here. Now, the asset viewer for me has been broken for at least 2 or 3 months. Every update breaks it. So we're going to have to do still images here, which I've been able to get. Every time I opened a vehicle in the asset viewer, it crashed my asset viewer. So I had to get a picture while the thing was crashing. It was wonderful. Great work and great fun. Obviously not. I'm also feeling pretty under the weather right now. So if you do have any questions or anything, then understand that I might be a bit late on answering them. But anyway, let's get into the vehicles. The first one is a crowd pleaser, and it is the F4J. This is one of the US naval variants of the F4, and we haven't actually got one yet. Obviously, we have the F4C and the F4E, and we have the Phantoms from the British point of view, but generally, these haven't been seen. You know, the F4J is looking pretty cool. It is an improved version on the F4B, and the main improvements that they had were the J79G10 engines, which obviously had a loss of thrust behind them. They added a radar, which is the ANAPG59. It's a pulse Doppler radar, so it gave it look down, shoot down capabilities. So once again, making it very similar to the British Phantoms. And also at the same time, because it's an improved F4B, it doesn't actually have the internal gun in it. You know, the F4E is one, or I think the first one, which had access to it, but the naval versions didn't have access to that feature. So if you want to use a Vulcan, I believe it's going to have to be in a gun pod. So very similar to the British Phantoms. I'm going to keep saying it because that's basically what it is. So the look down, shoot down capability, if it's given the same missiles as the F4E, you know, the AIM-7s or the AIM-7E2s, plus obviously either AIM-9Gs since it's navalized, or some other missile being the IR capabilities of this thing, it should make it pretty powerful. One of the things that we've seen with the British Phantoms is they've actually gone up in BR, probably due to the system and maybe a few other factors. There was a improved variant of the F4G as well, and I doubt we're going to get this one, but it's the F4S, and the F4S is a modified F4Js, and it was in 1977. They upgraded it to give it a strengthened airframe, smokeless engines, which is actually pretty cool, something we haven't seen in game yet, and also they gave it leading edge slats to improve mobility. So that is one to look for in the future when it comes to, you know, these general ideas. So hopefully we get something like that. But the main thing is, it looks like America is going to get a new Phantom, and this one should be better in different ways to the F4E, but worse in others. But I think overall people will prefer this aircraft over the E. The next vehicle in the files is the Mk.1, and this is the original designation of the Beriev Be-2. This is a little reconnaissance seaplane and would have been designed to be launched off of cruisers of the Soviet Navy. It was designed to replace the Heinkel He-55, which was licensed produced by the Soviet Union at the time, and kind of succeeded to do so. This vehicle didn't have a great track record. They didn't build a lot of them. Only around 10 to 20 were fully built, including prototypes, and what you ended up with was a vehicle which was looked down upon a lot by its pilots. It wasn't exactly one which it's one of those where the pilots didn't like flying it. It wasn't very stable in the water while taxiing, and it also wasn't stable just generally flying. And also, they had engine issues, so keeping it in the air and keeping it also repaired on the ground was not easy to do. It used a Shvetsov M25 radial 9-cylinder air-cooled engine, and this was a licensed copy of the Wright R1820, and it had 700 horsepower in it, which is pretty powerful for a biplane. And it had two fixed 7.62mm Shikasses looking forward. It also had a turret on the back, a 7.62mm Shikas, and could carry some 100-kilo bombs. But the thing is, this thing never really went anywhere. It was introduced in 1938 and served until 1942, but it didn't really fulfill its role very well for a few reasons. The first one being the instability, so normally it was actually deployed from land instead of from the sea, and also at the same time the Soviet Navy's cruisers weren't really up to standard when it came to catapults and that idea until about 1939. So it meant that it was introduced and there was not really a lot it could do. So it was, kind of as simple as that. By 1942, with Operation Barbarossa, the whole plan was abandoned when it came to it being used as a reconnaissance seaplane for cruisers. Instead, what they decided to do is they used it as a land-based reconnaissance and search and rescue aircraft in the Baltic. So yeah, it's got an interesting story, but not a great one for it. It's not one which really shined through its colors. And since it is an early war vehicle, we'll have to see which machines they actually plonk it on in the USSR. The next one is the E7K2, and this actually had a much brighter history than the Mk.1. What this machine was once again a reconnaissance seaplane, but this time for the Japanese, and they built over 500 of these things, showing how it was pretty used all over the place. And being a reconnaissance float plane, it had a 3-man crew, and also it had a few variants. So you have the E7K1 and also the E7K2. The main difference between them is the engine, with the E7K2 using the slightly more powerful Mitsubishi Zusei 11 radial engine. This vehicle gave it 850 horsepower. It had a 2-bladed metal propeller as well, and it had one Type 97 machine gun looking forward, and also 2 trainable 7.7mm Lewis guns, one in the dorsal turret and one in the ventral position. It could also carry 120 kilo bombs, so pretty similar to the other machines. But yeah, it was generally a vehicle which was used until 1943. It was used throughout the war and also since the mid-1930s. So this machine is pretty good, it's one of the standard ones that Japan used, and generally I think it could be pretty much put on anything. There's a few in-game that already have this thing modeled, so I wouldn't be surprised if they get the mechanic of hydroplanes pretty soon. There's also another Japanese seaplane, and this is the E8N2, and this was another very successful reconnaissance plane. They built over 700 of these things. It was introduced in 1935, and what is interesting is this is one which actually isn't just used by Japan. The Kriegsmarine, or Germany, actually used this as well. They only used one, though, I believe, on the auxiliary cruiser, the Orion, which which is an interesting story that maybe we'll get into at some point. But this was mainly used during the Second Sino-Japanese War. It was used in many different roles, and being the E8N2, once again, just like the E7K2, the major difference between it and its predecessor is the engine. The E8N1 used a 580 horsepower Nakajima Kotobuki radial engine, whereas the E8N2 used a 630 horsepower Nakajima Kotobuki Kai2 engine. So that's the major difference between the two. All of these were built by Nakajima and also Kawanishi, and had access to two 7.7mm guns, a crew of 2, and also 30 kilo bombs. So not as big as some of the other ones we've seen, but yeah, still up there. Another little tidbit about this plane: it has maybe the best reporting name ever from the Allies' point of view. The reporting name of this plane was Dave. Britain also gets its hands on a float plane, and this is the Osprey Mk.4. This was actually made and developed by Hawker, the guys behind the Hurricane, and also behind the Hawker Hart, which was a light bomber that the Osprey was based on. The Osprey being, once again, a fleet spotter and reconnaissance aircraft, it had a bunch of modifications to it and variants from the Hart, including the Mk.1, 2, 3, and 4. It was actually one of those which wasn't used a lot during the war. It was used on it was used on ships until about 1938, and it had second-line duties until 1940. So by the time the war started, this thing was already out of service on ships. So that'll give you an idea of what ships it's going to be on when it comes to War Thunder itself. It had the same airframe as the Hart, with slight differences when it comes to some of its needs. Obviously, it needed some floats on it instead of wheels, which made a big difference. That was the main difference between the Mk.1 and Mk.2 Osprey, the type of floats that it used. The Mk.3 had itself a dinghy, which is pretty cool, and the Mk.4 of 1935, the major difference is that it used a better engine. It used the Kestrel 5, which gave it 640 horsepower. It also had access to two 303-inch machine guns, and one was forward firing and one was in the back cockpit, showing that it had a few crew members. And then also at the same time, when it comes to this vehicle, generally it would have been used extensively during that time period. There's a decent amount of them built, and also one of the key things to look at a lot of these vehicles is they're kind of the latest variant of a series of float planes. So we're going for the biggest and the best first off. The next vehicle is labeled as the SOC-1, and when I tried to have a look it up, I couldn't actually find anything about it. But then, while I was streaming, somebody mentioned, well, what about the Seagull? And they were completely right. The machine that we see in front of us is the Curtiss SOC Seagull, and this was an American single-engine scout observation seaplane. They made over 300 of them, and also at the same time, it is the first one which actually was used throughout the war. So its first flight was in 1934, and it was started production in 1935, and it was retired in 1945. So this is the first aircraft that survived the whole of the war that we've seen when it comes to these biplanes, or hydroplanes so far. And there was a bunch of variants of this one made, but obviously it was a vehicle which was the predecessor kind of to the OS-2U Kingfisher, which most battleships transitioned to by 1941, but it was still kind of useful. The SOC-1 is the initial production version of this aircraft. It had a 550 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R1314-18 engine, and there was 130 of them built. It had one fixed forward-firing 7.62mm Browning. It also had a flexible Browning in the back as well, and could carry 650 pounds or nearly 300 kilos of bombs. Then we have the Walrus, which is an absolutely beautiful aircraft, and reminds me of a Beatles song as well. I am the Eggman, I am the Walrus. This machine was a single-engine amphibious biplane, which was created by R.J. Mitchell and manufactured by Supermarine. So it has a pretty storied history. It was also one of those which was not just used by the Royal Navy, it was ferried out all over the place. So it was used by Canada, Australia, even Argentina had their hands in it. Egypt, France, Ireland, Soviet Union used some of them. Even Turkey and New Zealand were involved into this little machine. So this was used all over the place and served pretty much during the whole war. It was produced from 1936 to 1944, and also there was over 700 of these built. It was also developed from the Seagull, the Supermarine Seagull, which, at least in my opinion, is also an aircraft which hopefully we see at some point. And since this is the Mk.1 variant, it actually had a metal hull. The difference between the different vehicles is kind of interesting. So the Seagull 5 was the original metal hull version of the vehicle. The Walrus 1 was once again a metal hull version, but then the Walrus 2 was a wooden hull version of the vehicle in its entirety. When it comes to the actual the engine itself, obviously having to be quite powerful for this quite larger hydroplane that we've seen, it used a Bristol Pegasus 6 9-cylinder air-cooled radial piston engine, gave it 750 horsepower, and also it had two 303 guns on the one on the front of it in the nose and one behind the wings. It could also carry 6 100-pound bombs or two 250 ones. It could even carry some depth charges, which would be quite fun. This thing had a very long history of service, which gives credit to the vehicle itself. Then we have a few ships, which actually made it into the files as well. The first is an Italian cruiser, the Eugenio Di Savoia. This was a Condottieri class light cruiser, and it actually survived the war, weirdly enough. It was commissioned before the war in 1936, and then it was transferred to Greece in 1950 as a war reparation. This machine had 8 152mm in dual turrets, so 4 of them, very similar to the Kerch that we've seen from the Soviet premium point of view. It also had 6 100mm guns in 3 dual sets, 8 37mm cannons in 4 dual sets, 12 13.2s as well in dual sets as well, plus some torpedo tubes. This thing should actually be pretty useful. I hope it doesn't come in as a premium. But its general career, it's actually was used during the Spanish Civil War because of the pact between Franco and Mussolini. And on the 13th of February 1937, the ship went into action off the coast of Barcelona in Spain. It bombarded the city and actually caused some deaths. The cruiser joined the 7th Cruiser Division and went on a circumnavigation of the globe with a sister ship in 1938 and 1939, and then returned to La Spezia in March of 1939. During the Second World War, it was present at the Battle of Punta Stillo, the Operation Harpoon, and then also Operation Pedestal. It was hit during an airstrike carried out by Liberator bombers while berthed in Napoli on the 4th of December 1942, and one of the other cruisers, the Museo Attendolo, was badly hit and then later sunk. And after the armistice in 1943, it was used as a training ship at Suez. So even though this thing survived and it took part in a decent amount of the wars, it didn't come out with no battle scars. There are a few mentions as well when it comes to the files, which I can't seem to properly get a hold of or aren't fully there yet. The first one is the Mk.2 I don't know where this thing has come from. I can't find it anywhere. I'm not sure what it is. There is an MPK series of machines, but the major ones are the 201 and then also the 201M and the T. So we'll have to see what the K looks like, if it is something, or if it's just something which is mislabeled. The next one is the Pucará. Now, we talked about the Pucará in one of the other videos, because it kind of is here, but not really. The Pucará obviously being more of a CAS aircraft than anything else when it comes to Argentina. The only really interesting thing about it when it comes to the game is that it actually was sat in the German tech tree, even with it being Argentinian and probably having more of a tie to Britain. But then again, you know, I'm sure there'll be general ideas when it comes to Germany and how it's supposed to be used. The vehicle itself, with having the Hispano Suiza 20mm cannons, also having the 7.62mm Brownings, and also with 3 hardpoints being able to carry pretty much anything. The question is, what did it actually carry, not what it was capable to. That's always something which is very important. It also was powered by 2 Mk.2 turboprops, which had 978 horsepower each, which is pretty cool. So that would be awesome to see as well. Then we also have the 2 A4 variants, the H and the N. Now, I don't know if these were fully modeled. They seemed very similar to the A4 Elate, which we already see in the Israeli tech tree as a premium. So they are in the tech tree for Israel, so they will be coming when the tech tree is released. I just don't think they were fully there yet, which is why they weren't in the game. The A4N is a modified A4M, which was designed for Israeli service. The A4M was a marine version of the A4 and had a more powerful engine, the J52 P408 engine, and also it had a bigger cockpit, it had an IFF system, and also was later fitted with a bombing system, the AN/ASB-19, and also a TV and laser spot tracker, which might be quite deadly for the machine. Also, the A4H was present. This was some aircraft which once again went to the Israeli Air Force, which was based on the A4F, and it used the 30mm DEFA cannons, which were used in place of the 20mm, and some of the later A4Es used the 30s as well when it came to Israel, and obviously the one we have in game uses the 30s. It also had modified extended jet pipes. This was a protection against heat-seeking missiles, which is a nice little idea as well. So those were the 2 extra aircraft which were in there on top of everything. That's pretty much all the extra stuff in the files. Obviously you have all of the other things as well, like the hidden vehicles, but I've already done videos on them as well. So yeah, if you want to have a look, make sure to do so. I am going to pass out for a bit. Thank you for watching and have a wonderful day. I'd just like to thank Professor X 1718, Orange Tail, Sakoshi Tiger, BRFC 15, Teddy, John Ryman, Universe A, Eugen's Terry, Ambrosius McClellan, Daniel Stanton, Martinez, B. Young, and then Kyle Kin, Barine, Lafouche, and also Samuel Slick for supporting the channel.